There is a particular quality of light that comes to the high desert in the last hour before dusk, when the sun has dropped low enough to turn the sage to copper, and the shadows stretch out long and blue across the hardpan. And it was in that hour, 10 years after the story you are about to hear began, that a woman stood at the window of a homestead built where no house had any right to stand, and watched weather come rolling down off the western ridges like something with intention. She was perhaps 30 by then, though the sun and the years had made her look both older and stranger to age than that, the way frontier women often did, their hands telling one story and their eyes another. Behind her, on a mantle of rough-hewn pine that she had planed herself, sat an iron strongbox, dark with age, its lock long broken, its hinges rusted into a permanent and stubborn stillness. It was not locked. It did not need to be. Nothing in that house was hidden from her, least of all the things inside that box, which she could have recited in her sleep, and sometimes did. She did not turn from the window as the first gust rattled the shutters. She had learned, over 10 years, to read the sky the way her father once taught her to read land, the color of it, the drift of it, the particular green-gray cast that meant hail rather than rain, and she watched it now with the calm of someone who was no longer afraid of weather, or very much else. It is worth saying, before anything else is said, that this same woman was once 19 years old and owned exactly $11, and a wagon her own uncle had called worthless to her face, without a trace of unkindness in his voice, which was somehow worse than if he had shouted it. She owned, besides that, a bedroll, a sack of dried provisions, and a brass compass that had belonged to her father, and nothing else in the world, no family, no roof, no promise of one. What she did not own, what no one could have priced or counted out in coin that cold morning, was the thing that would matter most in the end, a caravan of wagons that had vanished into the Sierra foothills in the year 1859, dismissed by everyone in her town as the invention of a drunk teamster's imagination, a story told to frighten children and amuse men in saloons. She would be the one to find where those wagons stopped. She would be the one to learn why they never moved again, and what she found there, in a box canyon that did not appear on any map, would become the strong box on that mantle, and the fenced graves out past the tree line, and this house, and this life, and this exact hour of dusk with the storm coming on. But that comes later. Settle in, if you would, and stay a while, and tell us, if you like, where in the world you're watching this from tonight, before we go back to the beginning, to a colder morning, and a girl who had not yet become any of this. 10 years is not so long a span, as such things are measured out here, where the rock itself remembers ice ages the way a man remembers breakfast. But it was long enough, and to understand the strongbox and the fenced graves and the storm now gathering over that mantle, the mind must go back past all of it, past the wagon that would not stay level on its axle, past the $11 counted twice into her palm, back to a morning when she was 9 years old and did not yet know what an inheritance was, only that the frost that October made the freight yard's mud stiffen into ridges shaped like the teeth of some enormous comb. The yard smelled the way it always smelled before first light, of tallow and cold iron, of the ammoniac breath of the oxen stamping in their traces, of pine tar freshly brushed along a wagon tongue to keep the wood from splitting in the coming winter. Lanterns hung on nails along the fence rail, their flames small and steady in the windless dark, throwing long orange bars across ground that had frozen hard enough to ring under a boot heel. Somewhere, a chain dragged across a wagon bed, with a sound like a held breath let out slow. This was the world before anything went wrong, though no one standing in it that morning would have called it a world in need of saving. It was simply a freight yard on the edge of a town not yet grown large enough to matter to anyone who did not live in it, and a girl in a coat 2 sizes too big stood at its center, holding a tin cup of chicory coffee she had not yet learned to like, watching a tall man in a canvas duster check the wear on a hamestrap with 2 fingers, the way another man might check the pulse of something he loved. He did not look up when he spoke to her. That was his way. He spoke to the strap, to the ox, to the gray light lifting slow over the rail fence, and she learned early that his attention, when it came to her directly, came rare and full and unmistakable, and so she watched for it the way a farmer watches for weather. She did not know yet that this was a kind of teaching in itself, that a man who gives his full notice sparingly makes you value the noticing. She only knew that the cold bit through the coat, that her breath came out in a white thread that vanished before it reached the lantern light, and that somewhere behind her, in a house she could not yet see from where she stood, a woman was dying slowly of a fever no doctor in 3 counties could name, and that this fact, too, though she did not understand its weight, was already beginning to shape the years ahead of her, long before the first wagon train, long before any compass, long before $11 counted cold into an open hand. Her mother lived 4 more years past that cold morning at the rail fence, 4 years measured out in the small increments of a sickness that took its time, and the girl grew up in those years the way a plant grows up through a floorboard crack, reaching for whatever light came through the gaps in a household bent entirely toward one dying woman and one working man. The freight yard became her nursery in all but name. She learned to walk on ground packed hard by hoof and wheel, learned her balance holding to the iron rim of a wagon spoke before she ever held a doll, and she came to know the smell of the place the way other children knew the smell of bread, oiled leather gone soft and dark at the harness joints, the sharp animal warmth of mules standing nose to tail in the evening cool, dust and axle grease and the particular sweetness of alfalfa hay going brown in the loft. These were the smells of her father's attention, since where the work was, he was, and where he was, she went, trailing at the height of his knee, and then his elbow, and then, by 10 years old, near enough his shoulder, that men in the yard began speaking past her rather than around her, which she understood even then as a kind of promotion. She did not run with the other children of the town, the ones who gathered at the schoolhouse steps, or along the creek on Sunday afternoons trading marbles and small cruelties. She tried it once or twice, dutifully, the way a person tries on a borrowed coat, and found the fit wrong in some way she could not name. Their talk moved too fast and toward nothing, while the talk in the freight yard, sparse as it was, moved toward something always, a load, a grade, a distance to be covered before dark. She preferred the company of the ledger books, their columns of freight weights and mileage and toll fees written in her father's cramped, patient hand, and she preferred the company of land itself, the way it rose and settled beyond the town, in long dry folds that seemed, to her, to be saying something continuous and low, if only a person stood still enough to hear it. Other children thought her strange for this, and said so, in the offhand way children say such things, without much malice, and without much thought either. She did not mind it as much as they expected her to. She had already learned, from watching her father, that being minded by everyone was worth less than being noticed, truly noticed, by the 1 or 2 who counted, and in that yard, in those years, there were exactly 2 who counted, and one of them was already beginning, quietly, to fail. The one who counted, the one who was failing, taught the way patient men teach, not in lessons announced as lessons, but in habits repeated so often they became a kind of inheritance before either of them thought to name it that. He was a contract surveyor by trade, and a freighter by necessity, and he moved between the two the way another man might move between rooms of the same house, seeing no real division between the measuring of land and the hauling of goods across it, since both, he said, were only forms of the same question, how far, and by what path, and at what cost. He taught her to read slope, the way another father might teach a daughter to read scripture, slowly, and by repetition, until the meaning came without her having to reach for it. He would stop the wagon on some rise of ground that looked, to any other eye, like nothing at all, and he would say, "Watch how the water would run here if it rained tonight," and she would watch, and in time she came to see it, the invisible descent, written into the land's surface the way a sentence is written into a page. He taught her shadow next, how its length and angle told the hour more honestly than any pocket watch, which could run down or be forgotten, while the sun, he said, never forgot itself. And he taught her the compass last, though it was the compass she came to love best, not merely how to read it, but how to read its faults, the way its needle would drift a degree or more near iron ore, or a buried kettle, or an old axe head left to rust in the grass, so that a person who trusted it blindly could be led astray by exactly the instrument meant to save her, while a person who understood its weaknesses could correct for them and walk on straight regardless. He repeated these lessons across seasons, not once but dozens of times, in heat and in the particular gray cold of early mornings before a haul, correcting her by inches, never by anger, until the correcting itself became a kind of tenderness she did not yet have the age to name as such. She did not know, in those years, that she was being prepared for anything beyond the next delivery, the next grade, the next dry wash to be crossed before the light failed. She only knew that when she stood beside him with the compass in her palm, the brass warmed from his coat pocket, the whole shifting, unreadable country around them seemed, for a little while, to hold still and make sense, the way it never quite did when she stood there alone. It would be a long while yet before she understood that this stillness was the exact thing he was leaving her, packed inside a habit, long before he ever thought to pack it inside an object. There was one ridge in particular, one evening in particular, that she would return to for the rest of her life, whenever the country around her turned strange and unwilling to be read. It was late in a September that had been dry, even by the standards of dry Septembers, the grass gone the color of old rope, the light at that hour turning everything, rock, dust, the backs of the mules, her own hands, the deep orange of a coal about to go out. He had stopped the wagon there not because the ridge offered any particular vantage, but because he had said, without explaining himself further, that a person ought to stand somewhere high at least once a season and see how small the traveled distance looked from above. He had taken the compass from his coat, not to sight a line with it, only to hold it, the needle drifting and settling, as the wagon and the mules and the two of them cooled into shadow, while the ridgeline above them held the last of the light like a held breath. He told her that a person got lost in two ways only. The first was a bad instrument, a needle that lied, a landmark that moved, or was never where the map said it would be, and against that, there was correction, patience, cross-checking one error against another, until the truth showed itself in the gap between them. The second way was worse, he said, and had nothing to do with instruments at all. The second way was a person forgetting to count. He said it plainly, the way he said most things, with no weight put on it, beyond the weight the words already carried on their own. A person is only lost, he told her, so long as she stops counting her own steps. The moment she starts again, wherever she starts, she has already begun finding her way back, because distance behind her is a fact, solid as a fence post, and a fact can always be walked back along, slow as that walking might be. She had been young enough then to think he was speaking only of trails and dry washes and the particular arithmetic of freighting, of paces and degrees, and the small corrections a good teamster made without ever remarking on them aloud. She had not yet lived long enough to understand that he was also speaking of grief, of the kind of country a person wanders into after a loss with no trail markers at all, where the only sure thing left to hold on to is the discipline of counting, of tallying what is still known to be true, one pace at a time, until the ground under the feet starts, however faintly, to make sense again. She kept that evening the way she kept very little else from those years, whole, unblurred, the compass warm in her palm, the light going out slow over the ridge, and his voice, unhurried, laying down a rule she would not need in full until long after he was gone. Of the mother, he said almost nothing, and what little he said came sideways, the way a man will speak of weather that passed through years before and left the ground changed without leaving a mark anyone could point to. She had died of fever in a summer so ordinary that no one in the county thought to write the year down anywhere but a family Bible, and by the time the girl was old enough to ask questions with any real shape to them, the answers had already worn smooth from handling, the way river stones lose their edges. There had been a house with a garden. There had been a woman's voice singing something in a language that was not quite the one spoken at the supper table. There had been, and this the girl held on to longer than anything else, a blue dish that survived the fever and the burying, and every move after, kept wrapped in a flour sack at the bottom of a trunk, never used, never spoken of, simply kept. Her father did not remarry. He did not, so far as she ever saw, court or consider it. And in a country where a man alone with a small child was thought to be managing an emergency rather than living a life, this was remarked upon by neighbors more than it was ever remarked upon by him. He answered the remarking, when it came, with the same flat patience he brought to a bad axle or a washed-out Ford, a problem to be solved with the tools at hand, and the tools at hand were a wagon, a trade, and a daughter he decided early to teach rather than shelter. She understood only much later, turning it over the way she turned over most things from those years, that this had been its own kind of grief made useful, a man converting sorrow into instruction because he could not think what else to do with it, and that the compass and the counting, and the long evenings of pacing off distances against known landmarks were not separate from the loss, but built directly on top of it, the way a road is sometimes laid over the exact scar of an older one. She did not resent this. She understood, even as a child, that some fathers gave their daughters lace and porcelain and the safety of never being asked to be capable, and that hers had given her something else instead, a trade, a discipline, a way of reading ground that could not be taken from her by fire, or fever, or the closing of any account book. It was not until the winter he himself grew fevered, coughing through nights that stretched longer than any march they had ever paced together, that she understood exactly how much that inheritance was going to cost her to collect. The winter that took him arrived without ceremony, the way most true hardships do, not as a storm announced by red skies, but as a series of small, ordinary days that simply refused to end well. It began with a cough he dismissed as dust in the throat, the kind any freighter earns from enough seasons on dry roads, and for the better part of 2 weeks he went on measuring and pacing as though his body had not already begun its slow accounting against him. She remembered the particular sound of that cough at night, how it moved through the walls of the small house like something searching for a way out, and how she lay listening to it, the way she had once listened to him teaching her to listen to wind and slope, as though if she paid close enough attention, she might read in it some warning that could still be acted upon. By the turn of the year, he could no longer rise for the long walks that had shaped her childhood, and the lessons came instead from a chair pulled near the stove, his voice thinner, his hands less steady on the compass, but no less patient in what they showed her. It was in one of those fevered evenings, somewhere between clarity and the wandering that fever brings, that he mentioned, almost in passing, a wagon train out of the eastern settlements that had set off for a mountain pass some years before she was born, and had never been heard from again, dismissed by most as drunk talk or bad memory, but noted once, briefly, in a surveyor's ledger he had seen and never forgotten. He said it the way a man sets down a small stone he does not expect anyone to pick up again, and then the fever took the thread from him and he did not return to it, and she did not think of it again for a long while, not until years had passed and she had reason to. He held on through the hardest part of that winter with a stubbornness she recognized later as identical to her own, and it was in the earliest days of spring, when the frost had only just begun to loosen its grip on the ground outside, that he died, quietly, in the gray hour before full light, with the compass resting closed in his hand, as though he had meant to hand it to her that very morning. He did not leave her with a speech. He left her with the compass itself, pressed once into her palm the night before by fingers already growing distant, and 4 words spoken plainly, without embellishment, the way he had taught her to speak about all things that mattered. The 4 words were these: read the ground first. She carried them the way other daughters carried scripture, and in the 2 years that followed, she had ample cause to test them, though not in any manner her father would have chosen for her. Her uncle took the business the way a man takes on a debt he did not incur but cannot refuse, with a kind of resigned diligence, an accountant's grief. He was not unkind in those early months. He simply was not present in the way presence is usually meant. He signed the papers the lawyer set before him, paid the men their wages on the 1st of each month, and left the actual work of the freighting line, the routes, the loads, the grades a wagon could and could not climb before its axle gave, to whichever hands were nearest and most willing. Those hands, more often than any account of the business would ever say, were hers. She surveyed the crossings before the teamsters would risk them, walking the banks alone in the gray hour before the wagons rolled, reading the water's color and the give of the mud the way her father had shown her 100 times over. She corrected a foreman's grade estimate on the Cutler Road that would have snapped 2 axles in the first mile, and said nothing when the foreman took the correction to her uncle, as though it had come to him in a dream. She kept a ledger of her own, in a hand small and even, recording distances and drifts and the compass bearings that made the difference between a wagon arriving whole and a wagon arriving in pieces, and she watched her uncle sign contracts built entirely on numbers she had walked out herself, boot by boot, mile by mile. He was not a cruel man. That was the strange, quiet suffering of it. She could not even resent him cleanly. He paid her nothing, because the ledger listed no wage for a niece, kept on out of family obligation, and it did not occur to him, in any hour she witnessed, that the arrangement asked anything of her beyond what a girl with no other prospects ought gladly to give. He thanked the foreman for good routes. He never once thanked her, not because he withheld the thanks deliberately, but because in his accounting of the world, her work did not appear as a separate line at all. It was simply absorbed into the running of things, the way weather is absorbed into a season, unremarked upon, because it is only to be expected. She told herself, through the first year and into the second, that this was simply what an inheritance without a name looked like, invisible, unpaid, and hers to carry regardless, the same way the compass was hers to carry, closed in her pocket, its glass unfogged, its needle still true to whatever she pointed it toward, waiting, though she did not yet know for what. It was in that second year, on evenings when the freight office had gone dark and the ledgers were closed and weighted down against the wind that found every gap in the walls, that she first heard the story of the wagons that never came out of the foothills. It was not told to her directly. It was told the way most things worth knowing in that town were told, sideways, over a counter, half a joke and half a warning, by men who had heard it from other men, who had heard it from a teamster. Everyone agreed was not to be trusted on any subject after his third whiskey. The teamster's version changed depending on the night. Sometimes there were 9 wagons, sometimes 11. Sometimes the caravan had turned off the known trail, chasing a shortcut some fool had sworn to them, and sometimes it was Indians, and sometimes it was simply the mountain itself, closing its hand. What did not change was the year, 1859, and the fact that the wagons had set out from the lower valley in high summer, bound for a pass that, by every account, they never reached, and never turned back from either. No survivor walked out. No wreckage was ever found along the trail. The wagons had simply gone in, and the valley had simply gone on without them, the way it went on without everything eventually. She heard it the first time and thought little of it. She heard it a second time, months later, told with the same careless shrug, the same conclusion, that the old man was drunk, that the mountains swallowed fools every decade and always would, that there was no profit in chasing a story with no bones at the end of it, and she thought perhaps less of it than the first time. Because a thing repeated without changing begins to feel less like a mystery and more like furniture, something the town kept around without asking why. She did not write it down. She did not ask the teamster to repeat it slower, or ask him where, exactly, the wagons had meant to cross. It did not occur to her, in those months, that a story so thoroughly dismissed by everyone around her might be dismissed precisely because no one in that town had ever been taught to read a slope, a shadow, a compass drift, the way her father had spent years teaching her, patiently, without once explaining why it mattered until it did. She only knew, hearing it that second time, that something in her did not let the story go the way it let so many other things go. The price of flour, the weather report, the names of horses that were not hers to keep. It settled into her the way dust settles into the seams of a coat, unnoticed, waiting for someone to shake it loose. The morning her uncle chose for the closing of the account was the 17th of November, cold in the particular way that river towns are cold, with a damp that got into wool and stayed there, and a sky the color of an unwashed plate. She remembered the date afterward, not because anyone told her to remember it, but because it was written at the top of the ledger page he turned toward her, in his own hand, dated the way he dated everything, precisely, as though precision were a kind of virtue he practiced instead of warmth. He did not raise his voice. He never had. In 2 years of her sweeping his floors and greasing his axles and keeping his books straight while he slept off the whiskey, he did not think she noticed. He set the ledger on the table between them, the one with the brass corners gone green, and he turned it so the numbers faced her, and he said that the business, taken as a whole, the debts against the wagons against the debts, came out worthless. He said the word plainly, the way a man reads a weight off a scale. Worthless. Not hers, not his, not anyone's fault, simply the arithmetic of it. Then he counted out $11 onto the table, in coin, slowly, the way he counted everything, and he did not look up while he did it, and when he was finished, he pushed the small stack toward her with 2 fingers, as though it might otherwise slide off the edge of the world. He told her she could have the old supply wagon, the one with the cracked sideboard and the wheel that had gone soft in the spokes, because it was worth less to him than the trouble of selling it. He said this without cruelty, the way a man disposes of a thing he has already stopped thinking about. She did not argue the sum. She had gone over those books herself often enough. In the evenings, by lamp oil she was not sure she was permitted to burn. To know that arguing would only put her in the position of correcting a man who did not want correcting. She took the coins. She put them in the flour sack purse her mother had once owned, back when there had been a mother, and she felt the weight of $11 settle into the bottom of it the way water settles into a low place in the ground, taking the shape of whatever held it. Her uncle stood then, and went out to the yard without being asked, and knelt by the wagon's bad wheel with a mallet and a length of green ash, and mended the spoke himself, working in silence, his breath showing in the cold, and did not once look at her while he worked, as though the labor of his hands might say what the rest of him had already decided it would not. She let him finish before she moved, because that seemed the correct order of things, the way a person waits for rain to stop before folding the wash. When he stood at last and wiped the mallet head with his thumb, as if some grease might still cling there worth saving, he did not offer his hand, and she did not expect it. He said only that the wheel would hold to the county line, maybe past it if she kept off the washboard ruts, and that was the whole of his blessing. She went inside once more, into the room that had been hers for 2 years without ever quite becoming hers, and she gathered what there was to gather, which did not take long, because a life pared down to necessity does not require much time to pack. A bedroll rolled tight and cinched with cord she had waxed herself the autumn before. A sack of dried provisions, cornmeal, salt pork gone hard and gray at the edges, a twist of coffee she meant to make last, the flour sack purse with its $11, tied twice over and pinned inside her bodice where a hand would have to work to find it. And last, from the shelf where it had sat wrapped in a handkerchief since the spring her father died, the brass compass, its glass scratched but true, its needle still swinging home to north the way it had every day of her childhood, patient as a thing that has never once lied to a person who trusted it. She did not wake anyone to say farewell, because there was no one left in that house who would have risen for it, and she had learned this fact in the particular slow way one learns a scar has stopped hurting, not by testing it, but by forgetting to guard it, and finding it does not complain. The morning was the color of ash, the sky not yet decided whether it would clear, and the yard smelled of wood smoke banked low and of the ash-cold dew that comes before a hard frost breaks. Her breath went up in front of her like something let loose. The wagon stood hitched and waiting, the mended spoke pale and raw against its weathered fellows, a small bright wound in old wood. She climbed up onto the seat, settled her skirts, and took the reins in hands that did not shake, though she noted, with the same distant attention she gave most things that morning, that they might have had reason to. Her uncle stood in the doorway with his coat open to the cold, watching without watching, the way a man watches weather he has already decided he cannot change. He lifted one hand, not quite a wave, more an acknowledgement that something was passing out of his ledger and would not return to trouble it. She did not look back a second time. She set the wagon rolling down the frozen ruts toward the road that led out of town, the compass riding in her lap beneath her folded hands, its needle already finding north before she had asked it to, the way it always had, the way it always would. The road out of town ran flat and pale for the first 2 miles, and then it began to climb, gently, the way land does when it is thinking about becoming something else. By mid-morning, the frost had burned off the wagon ruts and left them dark and soft, and the ox leaned into the traces with the patient indifference of an animal that has never once cared where it was going, only that it was going. She let the reins lie loose. She had learned that much from watching her father drive, that a wagon wants less correction than a nervous hand is inclined to give it. She smelled the smoke before she saw the camp, a thin gray thread rising from behind a stand of scrub oak near a dry wash, where an old man sat with a rifle across his knees and a coffee pot balanced on 3 stones, not troubling himself to look up until the wagon was nearly upon him. He wore a coat gone the color of the ground itself, patched at both elbows, and his beard had the yellow-white cast of a man who had spent so long in sun and wind that no other color could take hold of it. He asked her, without preamble, where a girl alone was bound with a wagon that new mended spoke, and she told him, plainly, that she did not entirely know yet. He considered that answer longer than it deserved, the way men do when they have more time than company. He asked if she had heard the old talk about the wagons that went up toward the pass in '59, and never came down the other side, and when she said she had, and that most called it a drunk teamster's tale, he made a sound low in his throat that was not quite a laugh. He said he had trapped that country 30 years before there was a name for the pass at all, and that he remembered the caravan, or remembered hearing of it from men who were still living then and were not living now. He said the wagons had not gone up the known trail at all, not past a certain point, and that a man could ride the whole marked route today and never once cross their track, because they had turned off it deliberate, some 14 miles past the last water, where a spire of red rock stood split clean down the middle, as if struck once by something larger than weather. She sat very still on the wagon seat while he spoke, the compass warm now under her folded hands, and when he finished, he did not offer more, only turned back to his coffee, as though he had already said everything a person could reasonably be expected to say about the dead. She sat with that for a long while after he had gone quiet, turning it the way she might turn a stone to see the side not yet weathered. There was no map for what he had told her. There was no map for any of it, she had asked, back in town, before she left, and the surveyor's office had nothing past the 14th mile marker but a blank space where the cartographer had simply stopped drawing, as though the paper itself had lost interest in that country. A blank space was not nothing. Her father had taught her that. A blank space was only a place no one had yet troubled to walk, with a chain and a compass, and the patience to write down what they found. She could have turned back there. That was the choice, and she understood it plainly, sitting on the wagon seat, with the old man's coffee smoke drifting past her, and the mule shifting its weight in the traces. She could have kept to the known freight road, the one with its worn ruts and its mile markers and its certainty, and called the whole business a story worth telling at a fire and nothing more. There would have been no shame in it. A girl alone with $11 and a wagon did not owe the dead anything, and the dead, whoever they were, had not asked for her particularly. But she thought of the compass warm under her hands, and of the voice that had taught her to read a slope by the way grass leaned on it, and to judge a day's travel, not by what a map claimed, but by what her own legs and eyes told her was true. Dead reckoning was not a comfort. It was a discipline, and it asked to be used, or else it withered into a story a person told about their father instead of a thing they carried forward themselves. She did not sell back the extra rope, nor the second water skin, nor the small store of dried beef she had bought thinking she might need less. She bought no map, because there was none to buy. At the fork where the freight road bent north toward the towns that still had names on paper, she turned the mule south instead, off the ruts, onto ground marked by nothing but the old man's 14 miles, and a spire of red rock she had not yet seen. The wagon wheel he had mended creaked once, settling into new ground, and then held. Behind her, the road narrowed and thinned, and finally vanished into the same pale distance as everything else, and she did not look back at it again. The days south of the fork settled into a rhythm that had nothing to do with hours, and everything to do with light. Heat came first, rising off the ground in a shimmer that made distant rock seem to breathe, and she learned to travel in the cool hours, and rest through the worst of it under whatever shade the mule's shadow could offer. Her hat pulled low, her father's compass tucked against her ribs where the brass would not scorch. By the third day, her lips had cracked and her hands had taken on the deep brown of a person who no longer thought of the sun as anything but a fact to be managed. She rationed water the way she had been taught, small sips at long intervals, and she found she trusted her own thirst less than she trusted the numbers she kept in her head, mileage and hours, the discipline holding where instinct might have failed her. Night undid what day built. The heat fled the desert as though it had never been there at all, and the cold that replaced it had teeth. She learned to build her fire small and long-burning, rather than large and brief, banking coals the way her father had shown her once on a survey trip when she was no more than 12, his hands over hers guiding the arrangement of stones. She would sit close to that small fire with the compass open on her knee, watching the needle hold its truth in the flicker of light, and it was in those hours, more than any other, that the grief came for her plainly, without warning and without mercy. It did not come as weeping. It came as a stillness in her chest when she turned the compass over and saw, faintly, the worn place on the case where his thumb had rested 1,000 times before hers ever had. It came as the memory of his voice correcting her bearing on a cold morning years gone, patient in a way the world outside their wagon had never troubled itself to be. She had not let herself feel the whole of his absence, while there had been a ledger to close, a wagon to load, and Uncle's cold arithmetic to endure. Out here, there was no arithmetic left to distract her. There was only the fire, and the needle, and the silence of a girl talking, sometimes aloud, to a man who could no longer answer. She did not stop moving because of it. She rose each dawn stiff with cold and dust, and checked her bearing before she checked anything else, the compass steady in her palm, the way his hand once had been, and she walked on toward a spire of red rock she had still not seen, carrying her grief the same way she carried her water, measured, unspent, enough to last. The Count had been building in her since the trapper's directions first passed to her like a coin handed across a counter, so many miles from the fork where the old freight road gave out, so many more along the dry wash, and then the turn, where a man's memory, however soaked in whiskey by the time she'd heard it repeated in town, had insisted the world changed shape. She had kept that count the way her father had taught her, not trusting the eye alone, which lied in heat and distance both, but pacing it out against her own stride, converting bootfalls into rods, and rods into miles, with the same patient arithmetic he had drilled into her, on 100 ordinary afternoons, when she had wanted only to be done with lessons and back at the fire. She had not known, then, that patience would be the inheritance that outlasted everything else he left her. On the morning the light came low and orange across the basin, throwing long blue shadows off every stone, as though the desert itself were reluctant to wake. She saw it before she was ready to see it, a formation ahead, where the rock had cracked clean down its spine, sometime before memory began, one half leaning from the other, like two old men who had quarreled and never spoken since. She stopped walking. She checked the compass, though she did not need to. She checked the count in her head, though she already knew what it would tell her. Both agreed with what her eyes were seeing. The spire stood exactly where the miles said it would stand, not a quarter-mile short, not a quarter-mile past, precisely at the reckoning she had carried in her body since the fork in the road 3 days behind her. She did not celebrate it. There was no one to celebrate with, and celebration had never been her father's way of marking a bearing proven true. He had only nodded, once, the way a man nods at a debt correctly settled. She found herself doing the same now, alone in the wind, a single motion of the head that no one witnessed, and that meant everything. The land had told the truth, his method had told the truth, and she, who had spent 2 years being told by her uncle's ledger that she amounted to $11 and a wagon not worth repairing, had just proven, with her own 2 feet and her own steady hand, that she could read the world as accurately as any man who had ever surveyed it for wages. She stood a long moment at the base of the split rock, feeling less like a girl who had once fetched water for her father's chainmen, and more like the surveyor herself, and then she turned the compass east of the spire, toward the canyon the trapper had sworn opened just beyond it, and began to walk again before the feeling could cool into pride and slow her down. The ruts appeared before she expected them, two shallow grooves pressed into ground that had not felt real rain in longer than she had been alive, and she stopped walking the moment she saw them, because some part of her father's teaching, some old caution about trusting a thing too quickly, told her to look before she believed. She crouched. She placed two fingers into the nearer groove, feeling the compaction of it, the way the earth here held a memory of weight, long after the weight itself was gone, and she thought of him crouching just this way, over wheel sign outside town, saying that ground remembers what passed over it, longer than people remember what they themselves have done. She followed the ruts on foot, leading the mule now rather than riding, because a woman on foot sees what a woman on muleback misses, and the arroyo opened before her the way a held breath finally releases, wide and dry, and littered with the pale broken teeth of stones the last flash flood had carried down and abandoned. It was in the shadow of the arroyo's east wall, half buried in sediment gone hard as brick, that she found the rim. She did not call it a wheel at first. It did not look like a wheel. It looked like a curve of iron, gone the color of dried blood, its wood long since surrendered to rot and insect, and 18 years of sun. The iron itself pitted and thinned, but unmistakably shaped by a hand that had meant it to carry weight across exactly this kind of country. She knelt beside it a long while, not touching it yet, the way her father had taught her not to touch a bearing, until she was certain she had read it correctly, and then she brushed the dust from its high curve and felt the old ridged texture of the tire iron under her palm, cold despite the sun, cold the way old iron always is, holding something of the years rather than the season. Not 30 feet further she found the yoke. It lay half swallowed by the arroyo's floor, one arm of it still raised slightly above the sediment, as though the ox that had worn it had knelt there and simply stopped, and the wood of it had silvered and cracked into long fissures, and the iron ring at its center had rusted into a rough orange lace that came away in flakes when the wind touched it. She stood over it for a long time without moving, the mule shifting behind her, the wind working steadily at the walls of the arroyo as it had worked at them for 18 years, without once being asked to stop. This was no longer a story a drunk teamster told over whiskey to men who wanted to be entertained. This was iron, this was wood, this was the caravan, arrived at last at a place where its telling could not be doubted, and she understood, kneeling there with the dust settling on her skirts, that she had only just begun to find it. She rose, brushing the dust from her knees with the flat of her hand, and followed the ruts where they climbed out of the arroyo and bent northward, faint as a scar half-healed, visible only because she knew now, to look for the places where the grass grew differently, thinner and paler, over ground that had once been packed by iron tires and the weight of animals long dead. The ruts did not run toward the pass. She stopped when she understood this, standing with the compass loose in her hand, its needle trembling faintly north, while the ruts themselves bent east, toward a notch in the rock she had taken, from a distance, for nothing more than a fold of shadow. Her father had taught her that shadow lies about distance before it lies about anything else, and she walked toward the notch with the patience he had drilled into her through 100 afternoons of measuring slope by eye and correcting for the sun, and the notch opened, as she came nearer, into a box canyon, walled on 3 sides by red rock gone the color of dried blood in the low afternoon light. The wagons were there, not whole, not as wagons are pictured in the telling of such stories, but collapsed into themselves, the way old things collapse, without violence, simply surrendering by degrees to years of sun and freeze and the slow prying work of wind. 6 of them, perhaps 7, she could not yet be certain, their beds sagged inward like the ribs of something that had lain down and never risen, their wood gone the gray of driftwood, their canvas bleached past white into a colorless film that clung to the ribbing in tatters and moved faintly, though there was no wind she could feel down in that stone throat of a canyon. She stood at the mouth of it with the mule's lead slack in her hand and did not go forward for a long moment because she understood, the way one understands weather before it arrives, that she was looking at a stopping place and not a passing place. Wagons bound for a pass left ruts that carried on. These ruts ended here, gathered here, as though something had called them all to a single point and held them. She thought of the $11 folded still in the lining of her boot, and of the wheel her uncle had mended without a word of malice, and of how small those things seemed now, set against 6 collapsed wagons, holding their silence in a canyon no map admitted to. The compass lay warm in her palm at last, the iron having finally taken something of her own heat into itself, and she stepped forward into the shadow of the rock walls, toward the nearest of the wagon beds, where something pale showed low against the ground beneath the broken boards. What showed pale beneath the broken boards was not what she had steeled herself to find. It was a stone, flat and deliberate, set upright against the collapsed wagon bed, the way a hand sets a marker and means it to be read. She knelt in the dust and brushed it clean with the side of her thumb, the way her father had taught her to clean a survey stake before reading its figures, and found no words on it at all, only a shape scratched shallow into the face, a simple cross, worn soft at its edges by 10 winters and 10 summers of wind finding its way even into that closed canyon. She stood and turned slowly, the way she might have turned a page, and saw that it was not alone. There were others. 6 of them, she counted, spaced with a care that no accident of collapse or panic could have produced, set at intervals along the canyon floor, the way fence posts are set, the way a man sets them who intends the line to be read by someone who comes after. Wagons that break down in flight leave their dead where they fall, in the haste of people still moving, still afraid. These stones had been carried, these stones had been placed. Someone had knelt here, in this stone throat of a canyon, with time enough and calm enough to gather rock and set it upright over the ones who did not walk on, and had done it 6 times over, without hurry, the way a man does work he intends to last. She thought of her father's hands guiding hers over the compass face, telling her that a line drawn true would still be true 100 years on, whether anyone ever came to read it or not. She thought that this too was a line drawn true, not a wreck, not a scattering. A camp, made in full knowledge that it would be the last one, arranged with the same order a family brings to a table before it sits down to eat. She did not know yet what had stopped them, whether it was fever or thirst or a wound that would not heal, whether it was one death that could not be carried further or 6 that came slow and by turns. But she knew, the way she knew slope and shadow and drift, that they had not vanished. They had chosen to stop, and someone among them had stayed upright long enough to see that stopping done with dignity, stone by stone, before lying down themselves. The mule shifted behind her, its lead gone taut in her hand, and somewhere above the canyon walls, a hawk turned once against the flat white sky and was gone. She looked back toward the nearest wagon bed, where the pale shape still waited beneath the broken boards, patient as everything else in that place had learned to be patient, and she made herself go closer. She did not dig. Her father had taught her that digging was what impatient men did when they wanted the ground to answer faster than it was willing to, and that the ground never rewarded impatience, only method. So she knelt instead, the way he had shown her to kneel over a survey stake when the numbers did not agree with the land, and she began at the wagon bed's edge and worked inward, board by board, testing each one, before she trusted her weight to it. The boards had gone soft in places, silvered and split, but where the wagon's iron braces still held, the wood beneath had been kept dry, and it was there, in the driest corner, farthest from where the years of runoff had found their path, that her hand met something that did not give. She worked her fingers along its edge in the failing light, which had gone the color of weak tea now, the sun dropping fast behind the canyon rim, the way it did in that country, without ceremony, without the long, slow good evenings of open plains. She traced a seam, a hinge, rusted to the shape it had died in. A lid, no larger than a Bible laid flat, boxed in iron gone the color of dried blood. She did not pull at it. She cleared the boards around it first, patient, the way he had taught her to clear brush from a boundary marker before ever touching the marker itself, because a thing pulled it wrong could be lost as surely as a thing left buried. When the box lay free, she sat back on her heels and looked at it for a long moment without touching it again, and she noticed, distantly, that she had stopped breathing. She took her knife from her belt, the same one that had opened dried meat and cut rope, and, Once, freed a wheel from a rut on a cold morning that felt now like it belonged to another life entirely, and she set its edge against the latch. The rust did not want to move. She did not force it. She worked the blade in small turns, felt the metal give a fraction, then another, the sound of it small and dry, in a canyon that had not heard a human sound in longer than she had been alive. The latch broke with no drama at all. A soft crack, more felt than heard, and the lid lifted a half-inch on its ruined hinge and stopped, as if unsure, even now, whether it ought to finish what it had started. She looked at that half-inch of shadowed dark for a long moment, the light behind her going from tea-colored to ash, and she understood, the way she had understood the graves, that whatever waited inside had been waiting exactly this long, on purpose, for someone patient enough to come and be trusted with it. She lifted the lid the rest of the way herself, with 2 fingers, the way her father had once taught her to turn a page in a survey book that had spent a season under rain, slowly, so that whatever had gone brittle would not tear itself apart in the act of being read. There was no gleam. She would tell people that, later, on the rare occasions she told the story at all, that she had expected, despite herself, some small flash of yellow catching the last light, because that was what the drunk teamster's tale had always promised, and some seed of that promise had lodged in her without her permission. There was no gleam. There was oiled paper, several layers of it, gone the color of old tallow, wrapped with a care that had clearly taken time, folded and refolded, the way a person folds a thing they mean to protect, for longer than their own life. She drew the packet out. It weighed almost nothing. Beneath the outer wrapping were land deeds, a dozen of them, the ink faded to rust brown but the lines of it still legible, still whole, boundary markers and section numbers, and a surveyor's hand, not unlike her own father's, patient and exact. She had expected bones. She had found paperwork, and somehow that was worse, in the way that a name is worse than a stranger. Beneath the deeds, folded separately, was a single sheet, and this one had been sealed once with wax, the seal broken long before she ever arrived, broken perhaps by the same hand that had wrapped it so carefully, as if the writer had needed, before closing the lid, to read his own words one more time. The hand was different from the surveyor's, looser, tired, the letters dragging toward the end of each line. It named an heir, a name, a town back east, a instruction that the land and its papers be delivered into that person's keeping, should anyone ever come looking on the family's behalf. And it said, plainly, without complaint, that the party had turned off the known trail and made camp here to wait. That word, wait, she read 3 times, in the failing light, because it undid something in her that the graves alone had not. They had not been lost. They had stopped on purpose, made their stand in this box canyon with its one thin seam of water, and waited for a rescue party sent ahead to return, and the rescue party had not come, and the waiting had simply gone on, past the point where waiting meant anything at all. She sat with the letter open on her knee a long while, the canyon going the color of a bruise around her, and did not yet know what she would do with a name that belonged, by every right she could name, to someone she had never met. She folded the letter along its old creases, the paper so brittle it whispered rather than rustled, and she thought of the word theft the way a person tests a loose tooth, worrying it to see how deep the ache went. The deeds were real. She had seen enough freight paperwork in her uncle's ledgers to know a valid instrument from a worthless one, and these were valid, signed, witnessed, the ink browned, but the language plain as a debt owed. Whoever held them held a claim to land that some clerk's office, somewhere, still recognized on paper, whether or not anyone living remembered why. And she was, at that moment, the only living person who knew these deeds existed at all. That was the trouble with it, not the law. The law, she suspected, would not much care how she came to possess a strongbox found beneath a dead man's wagon. The trouble was smaller and closer than the law, and it sat in her chest like a stone swallowed whole. If she carried these papers into some land office and put her own name where the dead man's instructions said another name belonged, no clerk would ever know the difference. No one would ever come to check, the heir back east, whoever they were, however many years removed from caring, would never learn that a canyon in the Sierra foothills had once waited for them and then stopped waiting. She could take the whole of it, the water seam, the pasture grass gone wild in the meadow, the very ground where the graves lay, and call it hers, by right of finding, and there would be no one left alive who could call her a liar. That was what frightened her, not being caught, being believed. She thought of her father then, not the compass in her hand, but the man himself, the particular patience he'd had for getting a bearing exactly right, even when no one was there to check his work, out on some lonesome stretch of scrubland, with only the sun and his own honesty to answer to. He had never once, in all the years she rode beside him, taken a shortcut just because a shortcut would never be discovered. She had thought, as a girl, that this was a kind of foolishness, a stubbornness that cost him nothing to abandon, and yet he never did. She understood it differently now, sitting in the dark with a stranger's name in her lap. A bearing taken wrong was still wrong, even if the wagon never struck the ditch it should have struck. A claim taken wrong was still wrong, even if no one on this earth was left to dispute it. She did not decide anything that night. She only knew, folding the letter into her coat against her ribs, that whatever she did next would have to survive her father's kind of scrutiny, the kind that asked nothing of witnesses, only of the work itself. She rode into the county seat 3 days later, the strong box lashed behind her on the wagon bed, the letter carried not in the box but against her body, inside her coat, as though it might lose its authority if it traveled with the rest of the iron and paper. The recorder's office was a narrow room with a stove that smoked and a clerk who did not look up from his ledger when she entered, the kind of indifference she had learned, by now, to read as neither insult nor welcome, but simply the ordinary weather of official rooms. She laid the deeds on the counter first, unwrapped from their oiled paper, and then the letter beside them, and she watched the clerk's pen slow as he came to the name written there, a name that meant nothing to him, and everything to the dead man who had written it, in a hand gone brittle and pale with age. She could have said nothing of it. She could have filed the claim in her own name, diligent finder, and no one in that room or any other would have questioned her, because no one else alive knew the name existed. The temptation did not come to her as a voice or an argument. It came only as an absence, a door standing open that she noted and did not walk through. She asked the clerk, instead, how a claim might be registered in trust, held for an heir not present, filed under his name and line, with her own name entered only as the party who had located and restored it. The clerk looked at her then, for the first time, with something like puzzlement, the particular puzzlement of a man watching another person decline an advantage freely offered. He asked her, not unkindly, whether she understood what she was giving up. She said she understood it well enough. She had spent 2 years understanding exactly what an $11 accounting could take from a person, and she did not intend to learn, by comparison, what it felt like to become the kind of person who took the same from someone else, dead or living. The paper took the better part of an hour to draw, the clerk's pen scratching in the smoky quiet, and when it was finished, she signed her portion plainly, without flourish, in the manner her father had signed his survey reports, legible, unhurried, a name meant to be checked against later, and found to match. She rode out of town with the strongbox lighter by one letter which she had left copied into the county record, and heavier, somehow, in some other measure she could not have named to anyone who asked. She did not know yet whether an heir existed to claim what she had set aside for him. She only knew the ledger, this time, was one she could stand behind, and she turned the wagon back toward the canyon with that settled in her like a stone laid true. The county did not move quickly, and she had not expected it to. A notice went into the record, as the clerk had promised, and a copy went east on the mail coach to whatever office might still answer to the name written in that letter, and then there was nothing to do but wait through a season that turned slow and full of its own weather. She spent that waiting on the canyon floor, in a canvas tent, pitched near the fenced graves, clearing brush from the old wagon ruts by day, and sitting with the compass in her lap, by the fire at night, turning it over the way she had as a child, watching the needle settle each time to the same true point, regardless of what the day had asked of her. Word came back after the first winter. An office in a river town had received the notice, had searched what records survived a fire some years past, and had found no family answering to the name, no cousin, no widow, no distant claim filed against it. A second notice went out the following spring, as the law required, posted the full term, and again nothing answered it. She did not celebrate this. She noted it, the way her father had noted a bearing, and went back to clearing brush. By the third year, the fence around the graves was cedar instead of scavenged wagon wood, set deep against frost heave, and she had traded 2 seasons of freight hauling wages for lumber enough to raise a cabin on the flat ground above the arroyo, close to where the lead wagon must have stood the night the caravan chose to stop rather than press on. She built it with her own hands, and the help of a hired man in the autumns, and she built it square to the compass rather than to the road, which no one but she would ever have reason to notice. The deed came through in the 5th year, plain language, her name entered as claimant of record after due diligence and care of the site, no heir having appeared to contest or inherit. She read it twice at the kitchen table she had built herself, then folded it into the same tin box where she kept her father's old survey chain, and went out to check the fence line before the light failed, because a post had come loose near the 3rd grave marker, and she did not like to leave a thing unmended once she had noticed it wanted mending. So this is where the story ends, and where it began, though you would be forgiven for not knowing which order those words belong in, since a life told honestly rarely moves in the direction the calendar insists on. The strong box sits on the mantel still, 10 years worn since the day it came up out of the collapsed wagon bed, black with rust and stubborn as a held breath, and she never did polish it smooth, the way a person might polish a thing meant for display. It stays pitted. It stays the color of old iron, left too long in weather, because that is what it is, and she never saw the use in pretending otherwise. Some evenings, when the fire has burned down to the shape of coals, and the cabin has gone quiet, the particular way a house goes quiet, once the work of a day is finally done, she will look at it the way another woman might look at a photograph. And she will think, not of gold, because there was never any gold, but of a caravan that stopped instead of pressing on, of people who set down stone markers with the same care she now keeps the fence that guards them, of a letter written by a hand steadier than the circumstances should have allowed, naming an heir who never came, because there was no one left to carry the news to him. She did not find a fortune, she has said this plainly, when asked, to the few who ask, and she says it without bitterness and without false humility, the way a person states a fact of weather. What she found was a family that waited far longer than any family should have to wait for someone to notice them, and what she inherited was not their land so much as their patience, the particular discipline of people who mark a place carefully because they trust, against all evidence, that someone honest will eventually come looking. Her father had taught her to read slope and shadow and the small honest drift of a needle, and she had believed, for years, that this was a skill for finding roads and boundaries and the straight true line between one point and another. It took the whole of that decade to understand it had been a different kind of instruction all along, how to arrive, finally, at a thing that had been waiting, and to arrive rightly, without taking more than was owed, without erasing what had gone before. The compass is on the shelf beside the strongbox now, its glass still clear, its needle still steady, and some nights she opens the case just to watch it settle, north as it always was, patient as the dead, patient as the living learn, eventually, to be.